When we first moved into our new neighborhood, it felt like a dream come true. The houses were neat, the lawns were green, and everyone seemed friendly enough. My wife and I had worked for years to save for that little two-story home at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours, and that made it perfect. The first few weeks were peaceful. Every morning I'd take a walk with our dog before work, wave to the older couple next door, and watch kids ride their bikes to school. My wife had just left for her naval deployment, so I tried to keep things tidy and calm until she came home. We had promised each other that this house would be the place where we'd start fresh, away from apartment noise and small space living. I still remember the first letter from the HOA. It was just a small white envelope tucked into our mailbox, with bold letters across the top, "Notice of violation." My stomach sank before I even opened it. Inside, the letter said my grass was 1 inch too long according to HOA standards. I laughed a little, thinking it was a mistake. 1 inch? Surely they didn't expect people to measure that closely. I mowed the lawn that same evening just in case and thought that would be the end of it. But a week later, another letter arrived. This one said I had left my trash bins visible from the street too long after pickup day. It was true, but only by a few hours. I worked late that night and hadn't gotten to them right away. I sent a polite email to the HOA office explaining the situation. No reply. A few days passed, then another letter came, then another. Each one seemed more serious than the last. One warned that if I didn't correct repeated violations, I could face fines. The most recent one included a picture of my mailbox, saying it needed repainting because the paint had started to fade. It was barely noticeable. I started to wonder if someone in the neighborhood had it out for me. I asked a few of my neighbors about it. Some of them laughed and said the HOA was known for being picky, but one man, Tom, looked more serious. He told me quietly that the HOA president, a man named Mr. Collins, liked to keep things under tight control. "He runs this place like a military base," Tom said. But without the respect part, that made me uneasy. I wasn't trying to break any rules. I just wanted to live peacefully. So I decided to attend the next HOA meeting. It was held in the small clubhouse near the entrance of the neighborhood. When I walked in, I saw a long table at the front with 5 people sitting behind it, including Mr. Collins, a tall man with slicked back hair and a sharp suit. He looked at everyone as if he were doing them a favor by being there. When my turn came to speak, I stood up and explained that I had received several violation notices and wanted to make sure I was following all the rules. Mr. Collins didn't even look up from his papers. He said in a bored tone, "The rules are in the handbook you received when you moved in. If you can't comply, maybe this neighborhood isn't the right fit." The room went quiet. I could feel my face getting hot. I thanked them for their time and left, trying to hold back my frustration. That night, I stayed up reading the HOA handbook cover to cover. I couldn't find anything that I had actually broken in a serious way. Still, the letters kept coming. Soon they started adding fees. $50 for a mailbox infraction, $75 for improper trash storage. It felt ridiculous. I called the HOA office several times, but no one ever picked up. Emails went unanswered. I even sent pictures of my property to show that everything was in perfect condition. Nothing changed. One Saturday morning, I walked outside to water the plants, and I noticed a stranger taking pictures of my front yard. I walked over and asked if he was from the HOA. He nodded and said he was documenting violations. He wouldn't tell me what kind, just kept snapping pictures. That was the moment I realized this was more than just a misunderstanding. It was targeted. It started to affect my sleep. Every time I saw a white envelope in the mailbox, my stomach twisted. I didn't want to tell my wife about it while she was away serving. She had enough to worry about. But keeping it to myself made the stress worse. About a month later, I received a thick envelope marked Final Notice. Inside was a bill totaling nearly $1,200 in fines. It also said that if I didn't pay within 30 days, the HOA could place a lien on my property. I couldn't believe it. I had never missed a mortgage payment in my life, and now someone was threatening to take our home over a mailbox and a few trash bins. I called Tom again and told him what was happening. He sighed and said, "You're not the first. Collins has done this before. He picks on new homeowners, especially if he thinks they won't fight back." That night, I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by letters, photos, and notes I'd taken from the handbook. I didn't know what else to do. I started writing a long email to the HOA board demanding a review, but I deleted it halfway through. I just felt powerless. A few days later, I got a new letter, this time marked urgent. My heart pounded as I opened it. The notice said the HOA was moving forward with eviction proceedings if I didn't resolve the ongoing violations. My hands shook. Eviction? That word didn't even seem real. I called the number on the letter over and over again until someone finally picked up. It was Mr. Collins. Before I could speak, he said, "If you'd taken care of these issues months ago, we wouldn't be here. You've ignored multiple notices. The board has the right to enforce compliance." I tried to stay calm and told him I had fixed everything. He laughed softly and said, "That's your opinion. The board doesn't agree." Then he hung up. For a few minutes, I just sat there in silence, staring at the phone. It felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. My wife was still weeks away from coming home, and I didn't know what to do. Every night I'd walk through the house wondering if we were going to lose it before she even got back. The next morning, I woke up to find a bright orange paper taped to our front door. It said, "Final warning, property subject to HOA action." I stood there staring at it, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. Neighbors walking their dogs slowed down to look but didn't say a word. That evening, I finally told my wife everything over a video call. She listened quietly while I explained, showing her the letters and photos. When I finished, she didn't say anything for a moment. Then she looked straight into the camera and said, "Don't worry, I'll handle it when I get back." Something in her tone made me believe her. She had always been calm under pressure, even when things got tough during her service. Still, I couldn't help but worry. By the time she returned, we might already be out of options. Over the next 2 weeks, I kept my head down. I trimmed the lawn twice a week, polished the mailbox until it shined, and made sure the trash bins were hidden perfectly behind the fence. But it didn't matter. A new notice appeared almost every other day. Garden hose improperly stored. Flag not approved size. Driveway oil stain. It felt personal. Every letter carried that same smug signature. C. Collins, HOA President. The night before my wife came home, I sat on the porch watching the sunset. The neighborhood looked peaceful. Too peaceful, like nothing was wrong. Kids played down the street. Sprinklers ran in neat patterns, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was living in someone else's version of perfection. One where I didn't belong. When my wife's flight finally landed, I drove to pick her up. Seeing her step off that plane in uniform, standing tall and confident, made all the stress of the past few months fade for a moment. She smiled when she saw me, and I almost forgot about everything else. Almost. On the drive home, she asked about the situation. I tried to downplay it, but she pressed for details. When I told her about the eviction notice, her expression changed. She didn't say much after that, just stared out the window with that quiet, focused look she always got before making a plan. When we pulled into the driveway, she looked at the house, then at the orange paper still taped to the door. She got out, took one deep breath, and said softly, "All right, let's see how they handle this now." The morning after my wife came home, everything felt lighter for the first time in months. She woke up early, made coffee, and stood by the window quietly looking out at the front yard. I could tell she was taking it all in. The house, the neighborhood, the little details that had caused us so much stress. She turned to me and said calmly, "We're not letting anyone push us out of our home." There was something in her voice, steady, confident, the kind of tone she used when she was on duty. I knew she meant it. After breakfast, she asked to see all the letters and notices. I brought out the stack I had been keeping in a shoebox. She spread them across the table one by one, reading each line carefully. Every so often, she'd shake her head or mutter something under her breath. When she finished, she looked up and said, "They're bluffing." I wanted to believe her, but all those official-looking documents, the legal words, the threats, they felt very real to me. She explained that HOAs couldn't just evict someone from their home without proper legal grounds. "They can fine you," she said, "but they can't take your property unless it's been through court. And even then, it's a long process." That made me feel a little better, but she wasn't done. She started taking pictures of everything, the mailbox, the lawn, the trash bins, even the front door. "If they want to play games," she said, "we'll give them facts." Later that afternoon, she went through the HOA handbook and underlined every vague or confusing rule. She said it was written in a way that gave the board too much power to interpret things however they wanted. She didn't like that. This is what happens when people get a little bit of authority and no one questions them, she said. That evening, she told me we were going to the next HOA meeting together. I'm not going there to argue, she said. I'm going there to ask questions they won't want to answer. When the night of the meeting came, we walked into the clubhouse together. My wife wore her Navy uniform, not as a show, but because she had just come from base earlier that day. The moment we stepped in, all eyes turned toward her. Mr. Collins, sitting at the front of the room, straightened his tie and forced a smile. "Ah," he said. "You must be Mr. and Mrs." He hesitated. "The homeowners from Maple Lane." My wife nodded. "That's right. We received several notices that we'd like to discuss." She spoke in a calm but firm tone, her posture straight, her presence commanding. You could see the shift in the room immediately. The other board members glanced at each other, waiting to see how Collins would respond. He cleared his throat and said, "Well, as you know, our goal is simply to maintain community standards." She smiled politely. "I appreciate that," she said. "But your letters mention violations that don't seem to exist. So I'd like to see the documentation, the photos, the rules you're basing them on, and the record of board votes for each fine." You could have heard a pin drop. Collins blinked, then shuffled some papers in front of him. "I don't have that information with me right now," he said. "But I can assure you everything has been handled properly." My wife leaned forward slightly. "Then I'll wait," she said. "You've had no problem sending letters, so I assume you have the records." Some people in the audience tried to hide their smiles. Others looked nervous. Collins finally muttered that he'd send the paperwork in due time. My wife nodded, thanked him, and calmly added, "Please note that we'll be reviewing your procedures with the Housing Authority if we don't receive proper documentation within 10 business days." We left the meeting quietly, but I could feel everyone watching us. When we got home, I couldn't stop smiling. For the first time in months, I felt like we had taken some power back. The next morning, Collins himself came by. I saw him walking up the driveway with a stiff smile and a folder under his arm. My wife met him at the door. "Good morning, Mr. Collins," she said politely. He handed her the folder, saying he wanted to clear up any misunderstandings. She thanked him, took the folder, and invited him to have a seat on the porch. He declined and left quickly. Inside the folder were printouts of photos, mostly small things: a hose not coiled neatly enough, a recycling bin visible from the street, a flag slightly off-center. My wife laughed softly and said, "This is what they're using to threaten eviction." But there was more. At the back of the folder was a statement claiming we owed over $2,000 in unpaid fines. She frowned and said, "They're inflating the numbers. Some of these fines are for the same violation, just counted multiple times." That night she spent hours on the phone, first with a lawyer friend, then with a state housing office. I sat nearby, listening as she asked detailed questions about HOA authority and homeowners' rights. When she hung up, she said, "They've crossed the line. What they're doing isn't just unethical, it's probably illegal." The next day we started gathering evidence. My wife took careful notes of every letter and fine, then drafted a formal complaint. We also began talking to other neighbors. At first, most were hesitant. They didn't want to get involved. But when my wife explained what had happened to us, a few people opened up. One woman said she'd been fined for her garden fence being the wrong color, even though it matched the HOA's own approved list. Another man said Collins had threatened to tow his car for being too old, even though it was parked in his own driveway. It was clear that Collins had been abusing his power for a long time, and people were just too scared or tired to fight back. A week later, the HOA sent another letter, this time addressed directly to my wife. It said that her presence at the meeting had been disruptive and that uniformed appearances were not allowed at future gatherings. That was the moment she stopped being calm. "So now they're discriminating against service members?" she said, her voice firm. "All right then." She made a few more calls that day, to the base legal office, to the local news station, and to a state representative who handled veteran affairs. I didn't even realize how connected she was until then. She never raised her voice or lost her composure, but I could see the determination in her eyes. A few days later, we received a visit from one of the other HOA board members, a middle-aged woman named Carol. She looked uneasy. "I just wanted to say," she told my wife quietly, Not everyone on the board agrees with Collins. Some of us didn't even vote on those fines. He just does things on his own. That confirmed everything. My wife thanked her and asked if she'd be willing to share that in writing. Carol hesitated but nodded. "If it means ending this mess," she said, "I will." By the end of the week, my wife had gathered statements from 4 homeowners and 2 board members. She organized everything neatly in a binder: photos, letters, and testimonies. I didn't even know half the stuff she'd found. She discovered that Collins had been approving unnecessary maintenance fees and redirecting funds for personal use, like landscaping his own yard and repainting his house at HOA expense. When she showed me the numbers, I couldn't believe it. "He's been using the HOA like his personal bank account," she said, "and he's been threatening anyone who questions him." The following Monday, she sent the full report to the State Housing Department, the Attorney General's office, and the local news outlet. She didn't make a big announcement or brag about it. She just sent it and went about her day. That same evening, Collins called. I could hear him yelling through the phone from across the room. My wife just held the phone away from her ear, letting him rant. When he finally stopped to breathe, she said calmly, "From now on, any communication should go through our attorney." Then she hung up. I couldn't stop laughing, even though part of me was nervous about what would happen next. "You just dropped a bomb," I told her. She smiled and said, "No, I just turned on the light." Over the next few days, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers. People started talking to us more openly, asking what was going on. Some even thanked my wife for standing up to Collins. Then one morning, a black SUV pulled up to the clubhouse. 2 officials got out and walked inside. By that afternoon, word had spread that Collins was under investigation. That night, for the first time in months, I slept without worrying about another envelope in the mailbox. My wife sat beside me, reading quietly as the house finally felt peaceful again. She looked up at me and said softly, "This isn't over yet, but we're not the ones who should be scared anymore." I nodded, realizing that everything had shifted. The man who had tried to intimidate us was finally facing the consequences of his own actions. And it all started the moment my wife walked into that meeting wearing her uniform, calm and unshaken, reminding everyone what real authority looked like. The days after the investigation began felt strangely quiet. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, there were no letters, no new warnings, no envelopes with my name printed in bold. The air felt lighter, even though we knew things weren't completely over. My wife said it best one evening as we sat on the porch, calm before the storm. He's not the kind of man to walk away quietly. And she was right. About a week later, we received an invitation to another HOA meeting. This one wasn't written in Collins's usual tone. It simply said, "Mandatory special session. All homeowners encouraged to attend." It didn't mention what the meeting was about, but we could guess. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed. People who had never shown up before were sitting shoulder to shoulder, whispering and watching the board table. Collins was there, looking tense, with 2 men I hadn't seen before sitting beside him. One of them wore a badge clipped to his belt. My wife leaned over and whispered, "That's from the Housing Authority." When the meeting started, Collins tried to sound calm. He talked about recent misunderstandings, negative rumors, and outside interference. But when the official from the housing department stood up, the whole room went silent. He explained that a complaint had been filed. He interrupted, saying it was a miscommunication, but the official didn't let him finish. "Sir, we have documentation, financial records, and statements from residents. We'll be conducting a full audit." People in the crowd started murmuring. My wife sat still, hands folded, her expression unreadable. Collins's voice trembled slightly as he said, "Until this is resolved, all HOA fines and fees are suspended." That sentence alone made half the room exhale in relief. After the meeting ended, a few neighbors came up to us quietly to say thank you. Some looked embarrassed that they hadn't spoken up sooner, but my wife just smiled and said, "What matters is that you're here now." The following days were busy. The investigators requested paperwork from the HOA office and board members were interviewed. Collins stayed mostly out of sight. The man who used to patrol the streets with a clipboard now kept his blinds closed. Rumors spread that he was facing serious penalties if the audit confirmed what my wife had found. One morning, I saw a moving truck parked outside his house. Boxes were stacked by the driveway. It looked like he was packing up. My wife watched from the window, sipping her coffee. "He's not just moving," she said. "He's running." By the end of that week, the board announced that Collins had resigned for personal reasons. The announcement was posted on the community website and taped to the clubhouse door. People started celebrating quietly like they didn't want to jinx it. Kids played outside again. Neighbors started waving at each other, and the tension that had hung over the street for months finally lifted. But my wife wasn't finished yet. "It's not enough that he's gone," she said. "They need new leadership and accountability. Otherwise, someone else will end up doing the same thing." So she volunteered to help organize a community meeting, one not led by the old board, but by the homeowners themselves. It was the first time people in the neighborhood came together, not because they were forced to, but because they wanted to. Someone brought snacks, another brought a projector, and for once there was laughter in that clubhouse. My wife stood up to speak. She didn't give a speech full of big words or formalities. She just told everyone what she believed, that the HOA should serve the community, not control it. She talked about fairness, transparency, and communication. She reminded everyone that neighbors should look out for each other, not spy on one another. By the time she finished, the room erupted in applause. People started volunteering for different roles: maintenance committee, landscaping, finances. For the first time, it felt like a real community. In the following weeks, things changed quickly. The HOA stopped sending threatening letters. Instead, they started posting reminders and updates that were actually helpful. They even organized a neighborhood cleanup day, and people showed up with gloves and trash bags, chatting and laughing like old friends. My wife and I joined in, happy to see how different everything felt. Still, the investigation wasn't over. The State Housing Department released a report confirming that Collins had misused HOA funds for personal expenses. The report detailed payments for private lawn care, home repairs, and administrative fees that went directly to his account. He was ordered to repay the money and was barred from serving on any HOA board in the state. When the news broke, it spread quickly. The local paper ran a small story about it, focusing on how residents had stood up for fairness. They didn't mention our names, but everyone in the neighborhood knew. For days, people stopped by our house just to say thank you. One man even brought a plate of homemade cookies and said, "You two gave us our home back." It felt good. But more than that, it felt right. One evening, as the sun went down, my wife and I sat on the porch again. The air was cool, the kind that made the world feel calm and clean. I looked at her and said, "You know, I never would have made it through this without you." She smiled softly and said, "You did fine until I got here. You just needed someone to remind them who they were dealing with." We both laughed. Then she grew quiet for a moment. "I didn't wear the uniform that day to intimidate anyone," she said. "I wore it because I wanted them to remember what respect looks like. Not for me, but for the rules they claim to follow." That line stuck with me. It summed up everything that had happened. The rules were supposed to protect people, not scare them. The HOA had forgotten that, but my wife had reminded them. A few months later, the neighborhood looked better than ever. Not because of strict rules or threats, but because people actually cared. The lawns were tidy, not perfect. Kids played without worrying about breaking some hidden rule. The flags waved proudly from porches, and no one measured whether they were approved size. At the next community barbecue, I noticed how different everything felt. People were laughing, sharing food, talking like friends instead of strangers. My wife was standing by the grill, chatting with some of the older residents who once avoided us out of fear of Collins. They were thanking her again, but she just brushed it off, saying, "I just asked a few questions." Later that night, as we walked home, she took my hand and said, "You know what's funny? When I was deployed, I always thought of home as peace. But sometimes peace takes a little fight to earn." She was right. What we had gone through wasn't just about unfair fines or bad leadership. It was about standing up for something bigger, the right to live without fear, even in a quiet suburban street. A few weeks later, we received a letter from the new HOA board. My heart jumped when I saw the envelope, but this time it was different. The letter thanked all residents for their patience during the transition and invited everyone to a welcome home celebration for the upcoming holiday weekend. It was signed by the new board president, a kind woman named Carol, the same one who had come to us quietly when everything was falling apart. The celebration was simple but perfect. There were flags, music, and a big banner that said "Neighbors First." I watched as kids ran around with sparklers while parents chatted and laughed. My wife helped hang the banner, then joined me at the picnic table. "This," she said, "is what a neighborhood is supposed to feel like." As the night went on, fireworks lit up the sky above the cul-de-sac. I looked around at the smiling faces and thought about how close we came to losing all of this. If we had just given up, things would have stayed the same. But instead, one act of courage, one uniform in a room full of silence, had changed everything. Later that night, when we got home, my wife folded her uniform and placed it neatly in the closet. She looked at it for a moment, then smiled. "It's funny," she said. "That uniform's seen battles overseas, but I never thought it'd help win one in our own backyard." We laughed, and for the first time in a long while, I felt completely at peace. The house was quiet, the neighborhood calm, and the flag out front moved gently in the wind. It wasn't just a flag anymore. It was a reminder that standing up for what's right doesn't always require shouting or fighting. Sometimes it just takes showing up, calm and steady, in the face of unfairness. And that's what she did. That's what saved our home. After the celebration, the neighborhood finally began to feel like a real community. People were kinder, more open and eager to be involved in how things were run. The fear that used to linger on every street corner was gone. My wife and I could finally enjoy simple mornings again. Coffee on the porch, neighbors waving as they walked their dogs, kids shouting and laughing in the distance. It was the kind of peace we had hoped for when we bought the house. Still, even with the calm returning, I could tell my wife wasn't fully at rest. She always had that look, the one she wore when she felt there was still work to be done. "The surface looks good," she said one morning, "but I want to make sure what's underneath is solid. We can't let this happen again." So she joined the newly formed HOA committee as a volunteer advisor. She didn't want power or recognition, she just wanted fairness. At the first few meetings, she helped the new members understand how to organize finances properly, how to handle complaints respectfully, and how to communicate with homeowners instead of lecturing them. People listened when she spoke. Her calm, confident tone made them trust her instantly. Over the next few weeks, things improved even more. The neighborhood newsletter changed its tone. It now had friendly reminders, gardening tips, and updates about local events. A few residents even started a book club, and another group organized a yard sale fundraiser to rebuild the community playground. The place finally had life again. One afternoon, while my wife was sorting through some old paperwork in her office, she came across something strange. It was a document from months before, tucked inside one of the old HOA envelopes we had kept for records. It looked like a maintenance invoice, but it wasn't signed by any of the companies that had worked in the neighborhood. The total was for thousands of dollars listed under landscaping and property enhancements. She frowned and said, "This doesn't match the records from the audit." Curious, she called Carol, the new board president, and asked if she had seen anything similar. Carol said she hadn't, but she'd checked the HOA files. A few days later, she called back, sounding unsettled. "We found several of those," she said. "Different dates, different amounts, all with the same signature, Collins's." It seemed that even after he was gone, there were still traces of his actions left behind. My wife looked at me and said, "He didn't just misuse money. He tried to hide it." She didn't want to reopen old wounds, but she couldn't let it go either. So she contacted the housing department again and shared what she found. They thanked her and said they'd add it to the ongoing review. It wasn't about revenge, it was about closure. She wanted to make sure no one else could ever take advantage of the neighborhood like that again. Weeks passed, and the investigation confirmed that Collins had funneled more money into fake invoices than anyone had realized. The final total shocked everyone, but the good news was that the housing department was able to recover part of the funds. Those funds were returned to the HOA's account, and for the first time, the neighborhood actually had a budget surplus. At the next meeting, Carol announced that the extra money would go toward improving the community, repaving sidewalks, adding lighting, and fixing the old playground. Everyone cheered. My wife just smiled quietly from the back of the room, happy to see that something good had finally come out of all the trouble. That weekend, the community came together for a cleanup and rebuild day at the playground. Parents brought tools, kids painted benches, and neighbors who had barely spoken before worked side by side. My wife helped organize supplies while I painted a fence near the swings. It was one of those days that made you forget the chaos that came before it. The laughter, the teamwork, it all felt like a second chance. In the afternoon, Carol called everyone together. She announced that the playground would be dedicated to those who fought for fairness and integrity in our neighborhood. Then she unveiled a small plaque near the entrance. It simply read, "A community built by courage and care." My wife tried to brush it off, saying it wasn't about her, but everyone knew that without her, none of it would have happened. As evening fell, the air was filled with music and chatter. A few people brought food. Others set up tables with drinks and desserts. Someone even brought a small speaker and played soft country music. My wife and I sat together on one of the new benches watching the kids play. She said quietly, "It's nice to see them smiling again. That's what makes all the stress worth it." Just when we thought the past was finally behind us, an unexpected letter arrived in the mail the next week. It was from Collins. It wasn't typed, it was handwritten in messy cursive. He didn't apologize, not exactly. Instead, he wrote that he had made mistakes and was trying to move on. He claimed he'd lost everything: his home, his position, his reputation. He said he didn't expect forgiveness but wanted to thank my wife for reminding me what accountability looks like. She read the letter twice before setting it down. "I don't know if I believe him," she said softly, "but maybe this means he's learning something." She didn't write back, but she kept the letter in a drawer, not as a reminder of him, but as a reminder of what happens when people stand up for what's right. Months passed peacefully. The HOA was running smoothly. The neighbors were closer than ever, and the sense of unity that had been built felt unbreakable. My wife started volunteering for a local veterans group in her free time, helping other service members adjust to civilian life. She said she finally felt like she was serving in a different way, by helping people find peace at home. One evening, Carol came by with some papers for my wife to review. They sat on the porch talking long after the sun went down. Carol said the new board wanted to hold elections soon, and that several neighbors had nominated my wife to be the next president. My wife laughed and said, "I didn't do this for a title." But Carol smiled and said, "That's exactly why we trust you." After she left, I asked if she would consider it. My wife looked thoughtful and said, "Maybe, but I think it's time other people take charge. I'll always help, but leadership isn't about holding on. It's about knowing when to let go." That answer was so her. She never wanted recognition, only results, and maybe that's why people followed her without her ever asking them to. As the seasons changed, the neighborhood grew even more beautiful. The trees turned golden, leaves scattered along the sidewalks, and families started decorating for the holidays. Every window glowed warmly at night. My wife and I spent our evenings walking through the streets, talking about how far things had come. It was hard to believe that less than a year earlier, we had been fighting just to keep our home. Sometimes new residents would move in and hear bits of the story from others. They'd ask us if it was true that the HOA once tried to evict us. My wife would smile and say, something like that. Then she'd add, "But that's not the story you should remember. Remember the part where everyone came together and fixed it. That was the heart of it, the change that came after the fight." One quiet evening, as we sat outside watching the sun dip below the rooftops, I said, "You know, I think you did more for this neighborhood than any HOA president ever could." She smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and said, "I just reminded people that this place belongs to all of us, not a rule book." The streetlights flickered on, and the air filled with the sound of laughter and conversation, drifting from the nearby houses. I realized then that home isn't just about walls and a roof. It's about the people around you. It's about fairness, kindness, and the courage to speak up when things aren't right. As the night grew darker, we sat quietly, watching the flag in our yard flutter in the breeze. The same flag that had once been called a violation now stood as a symbol of everything we'd been through. My wife reached over, took my hand, and said, "I think this chapter's finally closed," and she was right. The battles were over, the peace was real, and for the first time in a long while our home truly felt like home again. Months rolled by peacefully, and the calm that settled over the neighborhood felt like a deep breath everyone had been waiting to take. The trees were full again, the lawns looked greener, and laughter had replaced the quiet tension that used to hang in the air. Life finally had rhythm. My wife was back to her usual routine, splitting her time between her service commitments and her work helping local veterans. I went back to enjoying the home we had fought so hard to keep. Every day felt like a quiet reminder of how close we had come to losing everything, and how far we had come since then. One early morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee and the soft hum of the radio. My wife was already dressed in her Navy uniform, getting ready to head out for a ceremony honoring local veterans. She looked sharp, focused, and proud as ever. I leaned against the doorway, watching her adjust the small pin on her jacket. "You still make that uniform look too good," I joked. She laughed, shaking her head. "It's not about how it looks," she said softly. "It's about what it stands for." That moment summed up everything about her. The quiet strength, the calm dignity, the sense of purpose. Even after everything we had been through with the HOA, she never carried bitterness. She always believed that good would win out, even if it took time. Later that day, I joined her at the ceremony. It was held at the community park, the same one that had been rebuilt after the HOA funds were returned. The playground was full of children, the air buzzing with chatter and music. A crowd gathered near the stage as local leaders thanked the veterans for their service. When my wife's name was called, the applause was louder than I expected. She didn't make a long speech, just a few words about honor, community, and courage. But when she finished, people stood to their feet. After the event, a few of our neighbors came up to talk. Some were new families who had moved in recently. One of them, a young couple, said they had heard about what happened with the HOA and thanked my wife for standing up for everyone. "You saved this place," the woman said. My wife smiled and replied, "I didn't save it. We all did by deciding to care about each other." That night we sat out on the porch again. The air was cool, the sky painted with the last colors of sunset. I could see the flag in our yard waving gently. It had become a small landmark in the neighborhood, something people always mentioned when they walked by. My wife looked at it for a while before saying, "You know, I used to think home was just where you lived, but now I know it's also about what you stand for." Life continued quietly for a while. The HOA meetings became friendly gatherings rather than tense debates. People brought snacks, shared stories, even laughed about the old days when every notice in the mailbox felt like a threat. My wife attended occasionally, not as an authority figure, but as a trusted voice. She reminded everyone that the rules should protect people, not punish them. Then one day she got a letter from her command. She was being reassigned to a training base for 6 months. It wasn't unexpected, but the thought of her being away again hit me harder than I admitted. She smiled when she saw my face. "It's just a few months," she said. "Besides, you've got plenty of neighbors to look after you now." And she was right. For the first time, I knew I wouldn't feel alone. The night before she left, the neighbors gathered outside our house. They had put together a small farewell dinner, tables filled with food, lights strung up between trees, and laughter echoing down the street. Carol stood up to make a toast. "To the woman who reminded us what real strength looks like," she said, raising her glass. My wife shook her head, embarrassed, but she couldn't hide her smile. When the morning came, I drove her to the base. The drive was quiet but peaceful. As we neared the gate, she turned to me and said, "Take care of our home. It's more than just our house now, it's part of something bigger." I nodded, trying not to show how much I was going to miss her. We hugged and she walked away, her uniform crisp, her steps steady. Watching her go, I realized that her strength wasn't in the uniform. It was in who she was every day. The months passed slowly at first, but the neighborhood stayed lively. People kept checking in, bringing food, sharing updates. One evening, I got a letter from my wife. She wrote about her days at the base, how she was training new recruits, and how she missed the smell of coffee on our porch. At the end, she wrote, "Keep the flag flying. I'll be home soon." Those words stuck with me. Every morning, I'd look out the window to make sure the flag was still there, moving gently in the wind. It wasn't just a symbol anymore. It was a reminder of resilience, unity, and hope. When she finally came back, the whole neighborhood turned up to welcome her. People stood on their lawns waving flags and cheering. Kids ran up with handmade signs that said, "Welcome home." It was overwhelming. My wife looked around trying to take it all in. "I think I liked it better when we were just the quiet house on the corner," she whispered, laughing. But I could tell she was touched. That evening, as the crowd thinned out, Carol approached with a small box. Inside was a keychain shaped like a tiny house with the words "Home for All" engraved on it. "From all of us," Carol said, "for reminding us what home really means." My wife's eyes softened as she thanked her. Over the following months, life fell back into its gentle rhythm. The HOA continued to thrive. New families kept moving in, and the sense of trust remained strong. Every now and then, someone would stop by to ask for my wife's advice on something, a disagreement, a rule question, or even personal guidance. She always listened first, spoke kindly, and left people feeling lighter. She never used her uniform or title to command respect. She earned it simply by being herself. One day we were sitting in the yard when a delivery truck pulled up. The driver handed her a large envelope from the city council. Inside was a formal letter inviting her to join a local advisory board on community relations. It was completely unexpected. She read it twice before looking up. "They want me to help other neighborhoods build better HOAs," she said, smiling. I grinned. "Looks like your quiet life just got busier again." She accepted, of course. Not because she wanted recognition, but because she believed every neighborhood deserved what ours had become. A place where fairness and kindness came first. Years later, the story of what happened with our HOA still gets mentioned now and then. Sometimes it's told at town meetings or local gatherings. People always focus on the moment she showed up in her Navy uniform, standing tall and unshaken. But what I remember most isn't that meeting, it's everything that came after. The rebuilding, the forgiveness, the small acts of care that turned strangers into neighbors. Now, every morning when the sun rises over our street, the light hits that same flag in the front yard. My wife still salutes it before heading out, even on her days off. And every time she does, I'm reminded of that long, winding journey, from fear and frustration to peace and pride. It's strange how life works. Sometimes you think you're fighting for a piece of property, but what you're really fighting for is the soul of your community. We didn't just keep our house. We helped rebuild something much bigger than ourselves. Looking back, I realized that what started as a fight with an unfair HOA became a story about unity, respect, and courage. The kind of courage that doesn't shout or demand. It just shows up, stands tall, and refuses to give in. And that's what my wife did, every step of the way. Even now, when I see her smiling at the neighbors or helping someone fix a broken fence, I think about that first day she walked into the HOA meeting in her uniform. I didn't know it then, but that moment changed everything. It didn't just save our home. It reminded everyone what it truly means to belong. And as I sit here now, watching her wave to the kids across the street and listening to the soft rustle of the flag above us, I know one thing for sure: no matter where life takes us, this will always be home.